brutal massacre broke out in the dark woods of the land between the lakes, devastating a family called the Janosiks. Out of the 4 family members who pulled their motor home into the shadows of Area 17, not a single soul survived the night. You might expect that this family had fallen victim to a bear or perhaps a tragic encounter with another human being, a drifter, a criminal, someone hiding in those endless woods. If that were the case, there would be records, there would be police reports, there would be newspaper articles and court proceedings, and a name attached to the crime. But reality isn't so simple. The official records were never released. The crime scene was scrubbed from history. The evidence, whatever was collected that morning when rangers finally arrived at the clearing, seems to have vanished entirely, leaving behind a multi-decade mystery that has never stopped haunting the people who live near those woods. Was it a predator of nature, a bear driven to unusual aggression, a mountain lion that wandered too far from its territory, or was it something else entirely, a beast that shouldn't exist, something that the authorities recognized, something they understood well enough to bury, and something they never wanted the public to know about? The answers, if they exist at all, have been locked away for over 40 years, but the story hasn't disappeared. It lives in the memories of locals who remember the whispers from that summer. It lives in the warnings that rangers still pass to one another about certain parts of the forest. And it lives in the land itself, 170,000 acres of dense wilderness wedged between 2 man-made lakes where the darkness comes early and the silence runs deep. This is the story of what allegedly happened to the Janosiks family in the summer of 1982, and why after all these years, no one has ever been able to explain it. To understand what happened at Area 17, you first have to understand the land itself. The land between the Lakes National Recreation Area sits on a narrow peninsula in western Kentucky, stretching down across the Tennessee border. It's bordered on the west by Kentucky Lake and on the east by Lake Barkley, 2 massive reservoirs created by damming the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers in the mid-20th century. Today, it's a destination for campers, hikers, hunters, and families looking to escape the noise of modern life. The brochures show sunny picnic areas, well-maintained trails, and smiling visitors posing beside lakes that sparkle under blue skies. But the land has a longer memory than the brochures suggest. Before the dams were built, this peninsula was home to small farming communities. Families had lived in these hollows for generations, working the land, raising children, and burying their dead in small cemeteries scattered across the hills. They knew the woods intimately. They knew which areas were safe and which were best avoided after dark. Then came the Tennessee Valley Authority. In the 1960s, the federal government began acquiring land for what would become the recreation area. Families were relocated, sometimes forcibly. Entire towns were condemned and demolished. Churches, schools, and general stores were torn down or left to rot. Some cemeteries were moved to higher ground. Others were simply abandoned, left to sink beneath the rising waters or vanish into the encroaching forest. By the early 1970s, the transformation was complete. The land between the lakes was open for business, a vast public wilderness where anyone could come to camp, fish, or simply disappear into nature for a while. But the old-timers who had been forced off their land didn't forget what they knew. And among themselves in the small towns that bordered the recreation area, they still talked about the things their grandfathers had warned them about. Things in the deep woods, things that didn't have names, things that watched from the shadows and moved in ways that didn't match any animal in the biology books. Most newcomers dismissed these stories as folklore, the exaggerations of rural people who had lived too long in isolation. Superstition dressed up as local color. But the stories never stopped. And every few years, something would happen in those woods that made people wonder if maybe the old-timers had been right all along. The family arrived on a Friday afternoon in the summer of 1982. The exact date has never been confirmed. Another casualty of the missing records, but most accounts place the incident sometime in late June or early July when the days were long and hot, and the campgrounds were filled with families escaping the summer heat. The Janosiks were not unusual. They were not adventurers or thrill seekers. They were not the kind of people who went looking for trouble in remote places. The father was in his mid-30s. By all accounts, He was a practical man, a blue-collar worker who put in long hours during the week and cherished his time off with S family. He had purchased the motor home a few years earlier, a modest model that was comfortable enough for weekend trips but nothing extravagant. He liked fishing. He liked sitting by a campfire with a beer in his hand, watching his kids play in the fading light. They were, by every measure, an ordinary American family. They had no idea what was waiting for them in Area 17. The main campgrounds at the land between the lakes were busy that weekend. Families had claimed the prime spots early. The ones near the water, the ones with easy access to restrooms and ranger stations, the ones where you could see other campers and hear the comforting sounds of children playing and radios crackling. The Janosiks arrived later than they had planned. Traffic, maybe a late start. Whatever the reason, by the time they pulled into the recreation area, most of the developed campsites were full. A ranger, or possibly an attendant at the entrance station, suggested they try one of the primitive camping areas, less crowded, more privacy. The trade-off was fewer amenities and more distance from help if anything went wrong. The father didn't mind. He had camped in primitive areas before. A little solitude sounded nice, actually. A chance to really get away from everything. The ranger mentioned Area 17. It was deep in the interior of the peninsula, accessible by a series of gravel roads that waned through increasingly dense forest. There were no numbered sites, no fire rings, no picnic tables, just clearings in the woods where you could park and set up camp however you liked. The father thanked the ranger and headed out. The drive took longer than expected. The roads were rough, the seepage minimal. Several times the father had to stop and consult the paper map he had picked up at the entrance. The mother grew uneasy as the forest closed in around them. The children, sensing her tension, grew quiet in the back, but eventually they found it. A small clearing surrounded by thick hardwoods, oak, hickory, maple, with enough space for the motor home and a modest campsite. The ground was level. A creek ran somewhere nearby, just audible through the trees, and there was no one else around for what looked like miles. The father smiled. This was exactly what he had been looking for. They set up camp as the afternoon light began to soften. The father positioned the motor home at the edge of the clearing facing the access road so they could pull out easily in the morning. The mother organized the interior, unpacking food and supplies while keeping an eye on the children through the window. The son helped his father gather wood for a fire. The daughter chased a butterfly at the edge of the tree line until her mother called her back. By the time the sun began to set, they had a fire going and dinner cooking on the small propane stove inside the motor home. The evening was unremarkable in the best possible way. They ate together at the folding table outside, watching the shadows lengthen across the clearing. The father pointed out the different bird calls to his son. The mother helped her daughter identify the shapes in the clouds. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up into the darkening sky. As night fell, the family retreated inside the motor home. The children were tired from the drive and the excitement of arriving at a new place. The mother got them settled in the small sleeping area at the back of the vehicle while the father stayed outside a while longer, watching the fire burn down to embers. The forest was quiet, peaceful. Later, he would tell his wife that something had felt different about the woods that night. Not wrong exactly, just still, as if the usual sounds of the forest, the insects, the night birds, the rustling of small animals had been muted somehow. He didn't think much of it at the time. He should have. It started around 11. The children were asleep. The mother was dozing in the front cabin area, a paperback novel open on her lap. The father was still awake, sitting in the driver's seat and looking out at the darkness beyond the windshield. The fire had burned down. Enter nothing. Without the flames, the clearing was pitch black. The moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, and the nearest artificial light was miles away. He heard it first as a rustling, faint, distant, the kind of sound you might attribute to a raccoon or a possum moving through the underbrush. He didn't react at first. Animals were part of camping. You heard things at night. It was normal, but the sound didn't fade. It grew heavier, slower, more deliberate. Something was moving through the forest, approaching the clearing, and whatever it was big. The father sat up straighter, suddenly alert. He reached for the flashlight they kept on the dashboard but didn't turn it on yet. He didn't want to wake his wife, didn't want to alarm anyone over what was probably nothing. He listened. The footsteps, if that's what they were, reached the edge of the clearing and stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing, just silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy, oppressive, like the air itself is holding its breath. Then the movement resumed. Something was circling the motor home. He could hear it now more clearly than before. Heavy footfalls in the gravel and dirt. A brushing sound as something passed close to the exterior of the vehicle. And underneath it all, a faint rhythm, almost like breathing, but deeper, slower, wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. The father's hand tightened on the flashlight. His wife woke. She looked at him, saw his expression, and immediately understood that something was wrong. "What is it?" she whispered. He shook his head. He didn't know. The circling continued for what felt like an eternity. The father and mother sat frozen in the front cabin, listening as whatever was outside completed one slow orbit around the motor home, then another. The rhythm was patient, unhurried. It didn't seem to be searching for food or investigating a curiosity. It seemed to be waiting or testing. At one point, the sound stopped directly outside the main door. There was a pause, a silence that stretched for 30 seconds, then a minute, then longer. The father held his breath. The mother gripped his arm so tightly her knuckles went white. Then came a new sound, something touching the door. Not pounding, not scratching, just touching. A slow, deliberate pressure against the metal surface, as if whatever was out there was feeling the door. Learning it, understanding how it was constructed, the handle moved just slightly, just enough to confirm that something was trying to open it. The lock held. The pressure stopped. And then from just outside, close enough that it seemed to be inches from the thin metal wall, came a sound that neither of them would ever forget. A low, rumbling exhalation, not quite a growl, not quite a voice, something in between, something that carried a weight of intelligence that no animal sound should possess. And then the circling resumed. The father made up his mind. He couldn't sit there all night trapped in the motor home listening to that thing circle them like prey. He had to know what it was, had to see it, had to do something other than cower in the dark while his family trembled behind him. His wife begged him not to go. She whispered urgently, desperately, keeping her voice low, so the children wouldn't wake. She told him they should wait until morning. They should stay inside. They should keep the doors locked and hope that whatever was out there would lose interest and leave. But the father shook his head. It was probably a bear, he said. A curious bear that smelled their food and wanted to investigate. He had dealt with bears before. Not often, but enough to know they were usually more afraid of humans than humans were of them. A little noise, a little light, and it would run off into the woods. He grabbed the flashlight. He stood up. His wife grabbed his arm one more time, and he saw something in her eyes that he had never seen before. Not just fear, something deeper, something almost like recognition. As if some ancient part of her brain, some instinct buried beneath layers of civilization and rational thought, knew exactly what was outside that door and understood that he should not open it. But he did. He unlocked the latch, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the darkness. The beam of the flashlight cut through the black. He swept it across the clearing, looking for movement, looking for eyes reflecting back at him, looking for any sign of the creature that had been circling them for the past hour. At first, he saw nothing. The clearing was empty. The trees stood silent at the edges. The gravel where the motor home was parked showed no obvious tracks, no disturbance. He took a step forward, then another. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in his grip. Behind him, his wife watched from the doorway. Every muscle in her body screaming at her to call him back, to slam the door shut, to protect her children from whatever was about to happen. She couldn't move. The father walked further into the clearing, turning slowly, scanning the treeline. His breath came in shallow gasps. His heart pounded so loudly he could hear it in his ears. And then he stopped. The flashlight beam had found something. At the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of the light, something stood. He couldn't make out details, just a shape. A mass, something tall, taller than a man and broad. Something that wasn't quite standing the way a bear would stand. Something that was watching him with an intensity he could feel even through the darkness. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the shape stepped forward into the light, and the father finally saw what had been circling his family. What happened next took less than 10 seconds. The mother, watching from the doorway, heard a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life, however long that turned out to be. A roar that was deep, guttural, and utterly unlike anything she had ever heard. Not a bear, not a mountain lion, not any animal she could name. And then her husband's scream, sharp, terrified, cut off almost instantly. The flashlight fell to the ground, its beam pointing uselessly at the base of a tree, and then silence. Her husband was gone, and whatever had taken him was still out there. The mother stood frozen in the doorway. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run. To leap out of the motor home and sprint into the darkness. To find her husband, to help him, to do something other than stand there with her hand pressed against her mouth and her lungs refusing to draw breath. But she didn't move. Some deeper instinct, older and wiser than the panic flooding her system, understood that running would mean death. That whatever had just taken her husband was still out there, that the only thing standing between her children and that creature was the thin metal shell of the motor home. She stepped back inside. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely grip the door handle. She pulled it shut. She turned the lock, and then she backed away until she hit the opposite wall and couldn't go any further. The children were awake now. The son sat up in his bunk, his eyes wide, his face pale in the dim light that filtered through the curtained windows. The daughter was crying, not loudly, not hysterically, but with a quiet, steady terror that was somehow worse than screaming. "Mom!" The boy's voice was barely a whisper. "Mom, where's Dad?" She couldn't answer him. She couldn't find the words to explain what she had just witnessed, couldn't find the breath to speak at all. All she could do was hold up her hand in a gesture that meant, "Stay quiet, stay still, don't make a sound." And then she listened. Outside, something was moving. It didn't leave. Whatever had taken her husband, whatever had ended his life in those few terrible seconds, did not retreat into the forest. It did not run away satisfied with its kill. It did not behave like any predator she had ever heard of or read about. It came back to the motor home. She heard it first as footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching through the gravel at the edge of the clearing, then closer, then circling. The same slow, patient orbit that had preceded her husband's death. The mother pressed herself against the wall, her children huddled behind her. She had no weapon, no phone, no way to call for help. The nearest occupied campsite was more than a mile away, and even if she screamed at the top of her lungs, the dense forest would swallow the sound before it reached anyone who could help. They were alone, completely, utterly alone. The circling continued for what felt like hours. In reality, it was probably minutes, 10, maybe 15. But time had lost all meaning. There was only the sound of those footsteps, only the occasional brush of something against the exterior of the vehicle, only the waiting. And then the footsteps stopped right outside the door. What happened next has been pieced together from fragments. Distant campers, a couple staying at a site nearly a mile away, would later report hearing screams sometime after midnight. The woman described them as the worst sound I've ever heard in my life. The man said he wanted to investigate, but couldn't bring himself to leave the tent. They lay there in the darkness, listening until the screams stopped and the forest fell silent again. They didn't call for help. There was no way to call for help. And by morning, they had almost convinced themselves they had imagined the whole thing. They hadn't. At the Janosiks campsite, the door to the motor home did not hold. The lock was sturdy enough for normal use, for keeping out curious raccoon, for providing a sense of security against the ordinary dangers of the wilderness. But it was not designed to withstand the kind of force that was applied to it that night. The frame bent, the metal shrieked, and then the door was open. What entered the motor home in those final moments has never been officially described. The mother, the son, and the daughter, whatever they saw, whatever they experienced, took that knowledge with them. All that remained by morning was the aftermath and the silence. The sun rose over the land between the lakes just before 6. The forest came alive with the usual sounds of morning. Birds calling, insects humming, the distant splash of fish breaking the surface of the lakes. To anyone who didn't know what had happened during the night, it would have seemed like any other summer day in the wilderness. But deep in the interior of the peninsula, in the clearing where the Janosiks family had parked their motor home, the morning light revealed something that would haunt everyone who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. The first person on the scene was a ranger named. Well, his name has never been officially confirmed. In some versions of the story, he's called Thomas. In others, he's simply referred to as the ranger or the first responder. What matters is not his name, but what he found. He was on routine patrol that morning, driving the gravel roads that wound through the primitive camping areas, checking for signs of illegal activity or campers who needed assistance. He had done this route dozens of times before. He knew every curve, every clearing, every spot where people like to set up camp. When he reached Area 17, he slowed the vehicle. Something was wrong. The motor home was still there. That much was normal. But the door was hanging open at an odd angle, clearly damaged, and there was debris scattered across the clearing. Clothing, camping equipment, a child's shoe lying in the gravel near the fire pit. The ranger stopped his vehicle but didn't get out immediately. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the scene, trying to process what he was seeing. His training told him to approach, to investigate, to render aid if anyone was injured. But something deeper, some instinct that had nothing to do with training, told him to wait, to listen. The clearing was silent, no movement, no voices, no signs of life. Finally, he opened his door and stepped out. The first thing he noticed was the smell. He approached the motor home slowly, one hand on the radio clipped to his belt. The damage to the door was worse than he had initially realized. The frame wasn't just bent, it was torn. Goes ran along the metal surface, deep and parallel, spaced in a pattern that didn't match any tool he recognized. The handle had been completely ripped away. He called out, no response. He called again louder, still nothing. And then he looked inside. Years later, in conversations with people he trusted, the ranger would describe what he saw in that motor home. He never spoke about it publicly. He never filed a formal statement that made it into any accessible record. But among the small circle of people who heard his account firsthand, the details remained consistent. 2 bodies were inside, the mother and the son. The ranger didn't enter the vehicle. He didn't need to. He could see enough from the doorway to know that there was nothing he could do for them, and to know that whatever had happened here was unlike anything he had ever encountered in his career. The injuries were severe, but more disturbing than the injuries themselves was the positioning of the bodies. They weren't crumpled in corners or sprawled where they had fallen. They were arranged, placed as if whatever had killed them had taken the time afterward to move them, to position them in a way that seemed almost deliberate. The ranger backed away from the motor home. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the radio. He made the call. The search for the father's body didn't take long. It was found approximately 40 yards from the motor home at the edge of the tree line. He was lying face down in the underbrush, partially concealed by the thick vegetation that grew beneath the canopy. The flashlight he had carried was never recovered. The injuries to his body were consistent with an animal attack, at least on the surface. But the rangers who examined the scene noticed details that didn't fit that explanation. There were no drag marks leading from the clearing to where the body was found. No trail of blood, no sign that he had crawled or stumbled to that location under his own power. It was as if he had been carried there and dropped. More troubling was the ground around him. The vegetation was disturbed, torn up, trampled, scattered, but only in a small radius around the body itself. Beyond that radius, the forest floor was undisturbed. No tracks leading in, no tracks leading out. Whatever had killed him had left no trail. One of the rangers, a man who had tracked animals through these woods for over a decade, knelt beside the body for a long time, studying the scene. When he finally stood up, his face was pale. "This doesn't make sense," he said. No one disagreed. The daughter was not. In the motor home, this fact took time to register. In the chaos of the initial discovery, the calls for backup, the securing of the scene, the attempts to process what they were seeing, no one immediately realized that the family had included 4 members, not 3. It was the ranger who first arrived, Thomas, who finally asked the question. "There were 2 children," he said, looking at the small sleeping area at the back of the motor home. 2 bunks, 2 sets of children's belongings, but only one child's body. Where's the other one? The search began immediately. Rangers spread out through the surrounding forest, calling out, hoping against all logic that the little girl might have escaped, that she might have fled during the attack and hidden somewhere in the woods, that she might still be alive, trembling in some hollow log or beneath some fallen tree, waiting for help to arrive. They searched for nearly an hour, and then one of the rangers stopped. He had been moving through a particularly dense section of the forest, about 60 yards from the clearing, when something made him pause. A feeling, an instinct, the sense that he was being watched. He looked up. The girl was in the tree. She had been placed in the fork of a thick oak branch approximately 20 ft off the ground. Her body was wedged into the junction where two large branches met the main trunk, positioned in a way that kept her from falling. Her arms hung limply at her sides. Her head was tilted back, her eyes open, staring at nothing. She had been dead for hours. The ranger who found her stood at the base of the tree for a long time, unable to move, unable to look away. Later, he would describe the experience as the worst moment of his life, not because of the injuries, which were consistent with those of her family, but because of the impossibility of what he was seeing. Black bears do not place their prey in trees. They are not climbers in the way that leopards or mountain lions are. They do not cache kills in the canopy. Mountain lions, which occasionally range into Kentucky, are known to cache kills in trees, but typically they drag them up from below, leaving deep claw marks in the bark. And a 5-year-old child, while small, would still be a significant weight. The physics of carrying her up a trunk and placing her in that particular spot didn't make sense for any animal the rangers knew. More importantly, there were no claw marks on the tree, no scratches, no gouges, no sign that anything had climbed. The bark was smooth and undamaged from the ground to the branch where she had been placed, and set down gently in the fork of the branches by something that didn't need to climb. By mid-morning, the clearing was crowded with people. More rangers had arrived. Local emergency responders, a sheriff's deputy who had been nearby when the call came in. They stood in small groups speaking in low voices, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. And then the other vehicles arrived. The accounts of what happened next vary depending on who is telling the story. Some say it was the Tennessee Valley Authority, the federal agency that managed the land between the lakes, who sent representatives to take control of the scene. Others say it was a different agency entirely, one that was never identified, whose personnel wore plain clothes and spoke in clipped authoritative tones. What everyone agrees on is that the atmosphere changed. The local responders were told to step back. The scene was no longer their jurisdiction. Federal property, federal incident, federal response. They were thanked for their assistance and informed that they were no longer needed. Some of them protested. Sheriff's deputy in particular argued that this was a crime scene, that there needed to be a proper investigation, proper documentation, proper chain of custody for whatever evidence was recovered. He was overruled. By noon, the bodies had been removed. The motor home had been towed away on a flatbed truck. Rangers were stationed at the access roads leading to Area 17, turning back anyone who tried to enter. By evening, the clearing looked almost normal. The debris had been collected. The disturbed ground had been rad over. The only sign that anything had happened was the absence of the family who had parked there the night before, and the silence. In the weeks and months that followed, people tried to find answers. Local journalists heard rumors and started asking questions. Families who had been camping in the area that weekend wanted to know what had happened. The sheriff's office received calls from concerned citizens who had heard whispers about a massacre in the woods. The answers they received were always the same. No incident matching that description had been reported. No bodies had been recovered from Area 17. No investigation was underway. No family named Janosiks appeared in any missing persons database or death. Registry, Freedom of Information Act requests filed with the TVA came back empty. The state police had no records. The county coroner's office had no autopsies. It was as if the Janosiks had never existed. Some people accepted this at face value. They concluded that the story was a hoax, an urban legend invented by locals or cryptid enthusiasts and embellished over the years until it took on the appearance of fact. But others noticed something strange about the official denials. They weren't casual. They were emphatic, almost rehearsed, as if the people delivering them had been instructed on exactly what to say and what not to say. And the rangers who had been there that morning, the ones who had seen the motor home and the bodies and the little girl in the tree, they weren't talking either. Not because they didn't want to, because they had been told not to. Over the years, a handful of rangers who worked the land between the lakes in the 1980s have broken their silence. Not publicly, not on record, but in private conversations, in interviews with researchers who promised anonymity, in late-night confessions to family members who could be trusted to keep quiet. Bits and pieces of the truth have emerged. One ranger speaking to an investigator in 1998 confirmed that an incident had occurred at Area 17 in the summer of 1982. He wouldn't provide details about what he had seen, but he confirmed that the scene was unlike anything in my experience and that federal officials had taken control within hours of the discovery. Another ranger, interviewed in 2003, went further. He said that in the weeks after the incident, personnel at the recreation area were given explicit instructions not to discuss certain events with the public. Those who violated this directive, he claimed, were quietly transferred or terminated. A third ranger speaking in 2011 described the creature. He hadn't seen it himself, but he had spoken to colleagues who claimed they had, not on the night of the Janosiks massacre, but in the years before and after. They described something large, something that walked upright, something that moved through the forest with a silence and speed that defied explanation. They called it different things. He said dogman beast, sometimes just eat. Nobody really knew what it was, but everybody knew it was out there. He paused before adding one more detail, and everybody knew not to go into certain areas after dark. What killed the Janosiks family? Over 4 decades, numerous theories have been proposed. Some mundane, some extraordinary, none fully satisfying. The most common skeptical explanation is that the entire incident is a fabrication, a campfire story that grew in the telling, a piece of folklore attached to a real location to give it weight. According to this view, the lack of official records isn't evidence of a cover-up. It's evidence that nothing happened at all. But this theory has problems. Too many people claim to have been there. Too many details remain consistent across different accounts, and the vehement of the official denials. The emphatic insistence that no such incident occurred seems disproportionate to a simple case of mistaken memory or local legend. A second theory proposes that something did happen, but it was mundane. A bear attack perhaps, or a violent crime committed by a human perpetrator. A drifter, a serial killer, someone who happened to be in the area that night. The more fantastical elements were added later as the story was passed from person to person. This theory accounts for some of the evidence, but not all of it. Bears do not place bodies in trees. Human killers do not typically gouge metal doors with parallel scratches. And the behavior described by the ranger, the patient circling, the testing of the door, the retreat and return doesn't match the pattern of any known predator, human or animal. A third theory suggests that the family encountered something unknown, something that exists in those woods but has never been officially documented. Something that the authorities recognized when they saw the evidence, and something they decided for reasons of their own to keep hidden from the public. This is the theory that the locals believe, not all of them, not openly, but in the quiet conversations that happen after the tourists go home. In the stories that grandparents tell their grandchildren, in the warnings that hunters give each other about certain parts of the forest. The third theory persists. Something lives in the land between the lakes. Something old, something intelligent, something that doesn't want to be found. And every few years, when the conditions are right, it emerges from whatever hollow or cave it calls home. And it hunts. The Janosiks massacre, if it happened, was not the last strange incident in the land between the lakes. In the decades since 1982, dozens of people have reported unusual experiences in the recreation area. Hikers have described finding tracks in the mud that didn't match any animal in the field guides. Large, elongated prints that seemed almost human, but not quite. The toes were too long. The stride was too wide, and the depth of the impressions suggested something far heavier than any person. Most of these witnesses don't know the Janosiks story when they make their reports. They're not cryptid enthusiasts or paranormal investigators. They're ordinary people, families on vacation, retirees on camping trips, hunters who have spent their whole lives in the outdoors. And when they describe what they saw, what they heard, what they felt, the details are remarkably consistent. Something is out there, something that watches, something that waits. More than 40 years have passed since the Janosiks allegedly pulled their motor home into Area 17. In that time, the land between the lakes has continued to operate as one of the largest inland recreation areas in the United States. Millions of visitors have camped, hiked, fished, and hunted within its boundaries. The vast majority of them have experienced nothing unusual. They've gone home with photographs of sunsets, memories of campfire conversations, and stories about the one that got away. But some of them have gone home with different stories. Stories they don't tell at parties. Stories they keep to themselves or share only with people they trust. Stories about the night they heard something outside their tent that they couldn't explain. About the morning they found tracks around their campsite that didn't belong to any animal they recognized. About the feeling deep in the woods that something was watching them from the shadows. These stories don't prove anything. They don't confirm that the Janosiks existed, or that they died the way the legend claims, or that something unnatural lives in those 170 zeros and acres of forest. But they raise a question. If nothing happened at Area 17, if the whole story is just a campfire tale invented to scare tourists and sell books, then why does the forest keep providing evidence? Why do people keep seeing things? Why do the rangers still warn each other about certain areas? Why, after 4 decades, has no one ever been able to fully explain what happened that summer? The land between the lakes keeps its secrets. The TVA has never acknowledged the Janosiks incident. The rangers who were there have mostly retired or passed away, taking their first-hand knowledge with them. The motor home was never seen again. The bodies, if they were ever autopsied, have never been traced. All that remains is the story and the forest and the silence. You can visit Area 17 today if you want. The roads are still there, winding through the same dense woods that swallowed the Janosiks. The clearings are still there, surrounded by the same thick hardwoods that blocked out the moonlight on that summer night in 1982. The forest looks the same as it did 40 years ago, peaceful, green, and utterly indifferent to human presence. But if you go, the locals will give you advice. Don't camp alone. Don't wander too far from the marked trails. Don't stay out after dark. And if you hear something circling your campsite in the middle of the night, something heavy, something patient, something that seems to be waiting for you to make a mistake, don't open the door. Don't go outside. Don't try to see what's out there. Because whatever killed the Janosiks, if it killed the Janosiks, was never caught, never identified, never explained, and there's no reason to believe it's gone. The forest is old. The darkness is deep. And some things that live in the hollows between the lakes have learned that humans, for all their technology and confidence, are still just prey. You can drive into the land between the lakes on a sunny afternoon and convince yourself that nothing is wrong, that the stories are just stories, that the shadows between the trees are just shadows. But when the sun goes down and the fire burns low and the silence of the wilderness closes in around you, you might find yourself listening for footsteps, listening for that patient, deliberate rhythm, listening for the sound of something testing your door and wondering if tonight is the night it finally finds a way in.